Welcome back, everyone. This is Tim with Little Crow Gunworks. This is the fourth video of our 22 Nosler series, and we're starting with the hand loads. Here we go. So we're going to be loading up the 75 grain Hornady ELD match and the 80 grain ELD match. These are a couple of our favorite bullets for long range and prairie dogs and coyotes. So we're going to see what we can get for performance in this 31-inch barrel. Load it out to the maximum length that we can load them. So with the Sammy Reamer, we can load them out to 2 and 843 or 2 and 483 overall length, and the factory ammo is 2 and 260. So that's quite a difference to be able to load it out another 220 thousandths. That's quite a bit. You're freeing up a lot of powder capacity there and can get quite a bit more performance out of the cartridge. So at 2 and 483, that is 1.940 to ogive, and that's going to be about 7 thousandths jump. So we're pretty close to the rifling. I found that a lot of things will shoot at that place if you're comfortable with it and know that you're really close to the rifling. In a scenario like that, also, your pressure is going to be as bad as it can get, basically. If you were going to jam, it would be worse, but if you're not going to jam and you're jumping at 7 thousandths, your pressure is going to be as bad as it's going to get, and any amount that you seat the bullet deeper in the case, pressure is only going to drop. So we're starting there, and then after we do our powder testing, if we figure that we need to play with seating depth to try to get a little more accuracy or a little more precision out of the groups, then we'll play with seating depth, and we'll be moving away from the rifling and seating the bullet deeper in the case. So let's start with what we're using. We selected 5 powders to test. We're doing essentially 10 different charge weights with each powder for the 75s and the 80s. So there'll be 10 rounds with the 75s with each powder and 10 rounds with the 80s with each powder. And we're basically just trying to see what our safe operating range is. And we're using IMR4895, which is the fastest powder we're using according to the burn rate chart. And then the next slowest would be Varget, next slowest would be CFE223, then N540, and then the wild card, Superformance. So typically that would be too slow for a case this size, but the boss has used it in the past and said it works surprisingly well, so we're going to try it. And if it doesn't work and we decide it's a no-go, we'll probably experiment a little bit with Accurate 2520. That's another really good powder, and it's also a ball powder, but it's a more appropriate burn rate. So if we have to go to that, we'll play with that as well. We're also using CCI Magnum 450s. That's one of our favorite primers. So I know a lot of guys especially on the internet, they'll lose their minds over the federal gold medal primers, whether it's the 205 gold medal or the AR match or the 210, 215. It doesn't matter. Everybody seems to think that that's the best primer in the world, is anything federal gold medal. I've been doing this a long time, and in my experience, you can find a super sweet load with just about any primer. In my experience, there isn't really one that's much better than the other. There are a couple exceptions. One of them would be like the Tula KVB7. It's a Russian bench rest primer that is no longer being imported. So if you have some, they're kind of worth their weight in gold. But for the most part, any domestic primers, I haven't found one to be really any better than the other. But we've had really good luck with the 450s, and they're actually available more than every 5 years. So that's what we're going to use. What else? So for equipment, we're using a Redding Ultra Mag press is the press I have here at home. It's overkill for this project, but I load some pretty big cartridges for other rifles, and the Ultra Mag it's a heavy duty press that you can do up to Chi-Tac size cases. And then for dies, we're using the Redding Type S match die set. These are a full length sizing die, which is the only way to go, in my opinion. and they're a bushing die. So you insert, if you're not familiar with these, when you're trying to set up the die, you insert different neck bushings to determine what size the die is going to size the neck down to. So you can get different size bushings. This one happens to be a 252, but they make different sizes. So a loaded neck for this cartridge is 254. So if 254 is loaded and we go to 252, that means we're getting 2/1000ths of neck sizing. And you can do 3, 4, 5, 6. We bought a few different bushings, because if we get to the point where we've done powder, we've done seating depth, and we want to try to get a little more out of it, we can try different neck tension. Sometimes that will help the group sizes, and sometimes it will also help the velocity numbers. You can take a load that you have that's existing, change the neck tension, and all of a sudden the standard deviation and or extreme spread might get better. So we might do that if we find we need it, but typically, in my experience, I haven't. I can get everything I want out of a load without tinkering with neck tension. So that's the die set. I think you can see the scale over in the corner here. This is an A&D FX120i, and I happen to have the McDonald Innovations Auto Trickler V4 on that, and I'll show you that a little bit later in the video, how that works. It's pretty slick. I used to load with a RCBS Charge Master, and that worked fine for a lot of years, but I got to a point where I was doing so much volume that I needed to figure out a better way, and the Auto Trickler V4 it's about, once you get it tuned and figure out what it likes and get it leveled right and all that, and get all the bugs worked out, it's probably 4 to 5 times faster than a Charge Master. So you're talking serious time savings, where you can charge a case, move the funnel, put the charged case in the press, seat a bullet, and by the time you take the loaded round and put it in the ammo box, the next charge is done. And you can get this cadence going where you're basically never waiting for the scale, and you can load a box of 100 rounds in about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. It's incredibly fast. It's probably the biggest time-saving piece of equipment I've purchased, aside from our case trimmers that we sell at Little Crow Gunworks. We sell the if you're not familiar with it, it's called the World's Finest Trimmer, and it is a huge time saver. So I used to trim brass the old-fashioned way with the the RCBS or Lyman hand crank trimmers, and our trimmer works in a drill, and it's like maybe 10 times faster, maybe 20 times faster than the old style crank trimmers. So when you get to loading really high volume, time savings is important. So anyway, what else? So we got primer, bullets, powder, dies, press, scale, talked about all that stuff. Oh, the loads, I suppose we should talk about that. So this is what we landed on for loads that we want to test. Let's see if I can get this to where you guys can see it, and hopefully you can read my chicken scratch. Hopefully that should be showing up okay. So this is what we decided to start with. So we have the 75 grain loads on the top, the 80 grain loads on the bottom. You can see the powders at the top of each column, from fastest burning to slowest burning. And you'll notice that the charge weights are in 0.12 grain increments. Why 0.12? Seems kind of like an obscure amount. Well, 2 reasons. One, 0.12 for a case this size was the correct amount, so that we could have 10 charges and go from approximately 54,500 psi to 62,250 psi for each of these charges. How do I know that? Well, I'm using I don't know if you call it an app or what you'd call it, but it's a program, a computer program that you can download. It's free. It's called Gordon's Reloading Tool, and it's a lot like Quick Load. I've played with both. I think Gordon's is better, and it's free, oddly enough. But if you're not familiar with what these programs are, you can input everything. Like, you can input everything but a primer. So you can basically input what cartridge, you can change the water capacity, you can change bullets, seating depth, barrel length, gun weight, twist rate, powder, amount of powder, everything. I mean, you can design cartridges on there. You can find out optimal barrel timing, which is what these little stars are. So I starred where the optimal barrel time was. If you're familiar with that, I'm not going to go into that in this video. That's an hour video by itself. But look up optimal barrel time on YouTube. You'll find stuff on it. Anyway, you can get a ton of information. So you input all your information. It's got to be good information. Otherwise, you know, garbage in, garbage out. So you put good information in, and it will simulate a pressure curve and therefore a velocity. And so what we tried to do was basically we decided what our ceiling is going to be, which is 62,250 psi or thereabouts, and then work our way down to get around that 55,000 psi mark. So that's why 0.12, and also the scale allows me to do that. So this scale is accurate to 0.02 grains. So if you ask for 0.03, you can't get it. It only works in even numbers. And for example, the powders we're using, like IMR4895, it's 0.02 per kernel. So this scale will allow, it has the program, the way Adam wrote the program for the auto trickler, is anywhere between 29.00 and 29.04 it will allow. So basically it's within one kernel of powder either way. And you can't really get much more accurate than that. Now, some powders, if you're talking a Magnum powder, bigger kernels, like for example, this is Vitivory N540, and these are again around 0.02 per kernel, but there's a heavier Magnum powder called N570. That's 0.09 per kernel. So like, you're basically getting a tenth if it drops one too many kernels. So anyway, it's super accurate. The scale allows me to go to 0.12, and 0.12 worked out for our pressure, so that's what we're doing. Now, disclaimer. Do not, under any circumstances, load anything you see here in a gas gun, in your AR-15. Do not load anything you see, even the starting charges, in your gas gun, unless you want a trip to the hospital. These are, again, around 55,000 psi at 2.483. I didn't look it up before I started the video. I probably should have, but if you loaded this and tried to smash it into 2.260, it's probably going to be around 80 or 90,000 psi. And if you do that in a gas gun, the gun's coming apart, and probably not in a good way. So don't load any of this in a gas gun. Even if it's in a bolt gun, I would recommend that any of you start below this number and work your way up to it. I'm just doing this because I'm familiar with the program. I know I have good inputs, and I'm on my 26th year of hand loading, so I've been doing it a while. So anyway, what do we have here? What am I writing next to these numbers? So this is our starting charge, and that's the velocity that Gordon's is predicting. So we're starting in the 3,200 foot a second range with the 75. And that's kind of just a note for me. So if I shoot the first charge and it's way below or way above that number, I know something's wrong. And I'll either approach with caution going farther or stop altogether and come home and pull them and do that ladder over. But, and then for the 80s, the starting charge weight should be somewhere in the 3,100 feet a second neighborhood, maybe a little over. And then I think the final charge weights, the top charges are for the 75, I think we're going to be in the mid 33s, 3,300 feet a second, 3,350, something like that. And then for the 80s, I think these are in the low 32s. So I think we only get about 100 feet a second for all these charges. So that's what we're going to start with. We'll see what we find out. Find a safe operating range. And then we're also trying to look at where on these ladders is the velocity pretty consistent, because you'll see maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of these charge weights in a row will have almost the same velocity. Usually you'll find that. And what you'll also find is when they have the same velocity, they hit in the same place on the paper. And that's kind of what we're looking for, is not necessarily identical velocity, but we're trying to find a window in each of these ladders where the point of impact on the paper is the same, meaning vertically. So we don't want to see shots stringing like this vertically. We want to see the same elevation. They might be a little bit left or right of each other, but we're trying to see the same vertical impact, because I've found in my experience that translates to short vertical at distance. So we're trying to find a happy spot in each window, so that way we know where to look further in the following tests, because I found that if you find that window and pick something out of it, you usually get a pretty good load. That doesn't mean you can't pick something outside of the windows, but you're kind of going against the grain and you're fighting what the gun's telling you. So you're probably going to have more work ahead of you if you go outside of those windows. So that's what we're after. So we're going to shoot these. Hopefully we can get all the way through the ladder before we hit pressure signs. And the Gordon's reloading tool was accurate, but if not, we'll stop and stay safe, and hopefully we'll still find a place to work in. So I think I'm going to take a minute and move the camera and show you how this scale works a little bit, and then we'll go out to the range and start shooting.
So before we head out to the range, just a quick little bit about the rifle here. So I did decide to clean it just because we had 100 rounds on the barrel, and I didn't want to go out and try to do this pressure testing with the starts of a carbon ring already in the neck, because that might give us a false reading on what the pressure ceiling is for these hand loads. And I didn't want that to happen, so I figured we'd start with a fresh, cleanish barrel. I just took carbon out. I didn't do anything for copper mitigation, so I'll just run through that right quick. So we use a long one-piece cleaning rod. I don't have that in view here, but I use Tipton rods with the ball bearing handle, so the rod can spin freely while you're holding the handle. And what I did was, using Modern Spartan Systems carbon destroyer just to remove the carbon, and then I chase it with their accuracy oil just at the end of the process, just a light coating of oil. So what I do is I take the long one-piece cleaning rod and I use a bore mop and saturate that with the carbon destroyer, and run that down the barrel a bunch of times to get the barrel good and saturated. This was white when I started. So I saturate the barrel. That takes a lot of the loose carbon out. I let that sit for about a minute, and then I use a nylon brush and I do 20 strokes back and forth to break that carbon loose, and then I start pushing patches with a jag. So this was the first patch. You can see pretty dirty. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I re-ran the bore mop, then another 20 strokes with the brush, put the jag back on, and this was the first patch again. 2, 3, you can see by the third one it's almost clean. So then I just did 2 dry patches to get any of that carbon destroyer out that was still in there. Then I did a wet patch of accuracy oil, followed by a dry patch to get the excess. And I use a bore guide for everything. If you don't use a bore guide, you should, just to keep all the gunk out of your action and your trigger group. So after the dry patch to get the extra accuracy oil, I use a big mop to clean out the throat and the neck area of the chamber. You can see there was a lot of powder falling and crud in there. So I got all that out, so the chamber is nice and clean, the neck's nice and clean. Then I take one of these slotted tips and put 2 patches in it and pull them from opposite directions, so it creates like this big wing looking thing, and I run that in to where the lugs are on the bolt to get any crud that might have fallen down in those journals. And once I do that, I'm done. So that's the extent of what I do for carbon remediation. I typically don't take copper out. I mean, I'm not a competition shooter. I know those guys scrub the hell out of everything every time they use it, but I don't do that. If the gun's shooting, I don't bother trying to take the copper out. I just will do carbon remediation now and then. So that's what I do to remove copper. Just want to show you that quick before we go out to the range, because I want to get accurate results here. I don't want to get any false pressure sealing. So I figured it was good to start with a fresh barrel, and we should be able to get through this 100 rounds of testing without any weird anomaly. So we'll see you at the range. Okay, we're out on the range. We're going to test these hand loads. It's a little less than ideal conditions today. It's a little brisk. It's about 48 degrees, which is good because I'll be able to cool the barrel a little faster. I'm going to employ my chamber chiller here so I can keep the cadence high and not be out here all day. But with the volume of shots I'm going to be taking, I don't think I'm going to drag you guys along for every single shot. After I shoot each string of 10 for a certain bullet weight, I'll maybe do a little bench review and go over what I saw with each one, and try to keep this video a little shorter, because if I take you along, it's going to be an hour and a half or 2 hours. So we're going to get started. I think what I'm going to do is start with the 75 grain Superformance, and because I cleaned the barrel, so I got to get a little bit of fouling in there, and I think that Superformance, I'm thinking it's not going to shoot that well till we get toward the higher charges, so I'm going to start with that to kind of follow the barrel. And I'll start at the center bullseye with the Superformance, and then the upper left I'll do IMR4895, upper right I'll do Varget, lower left CFE223, and lower right N540. And I'm just going to pick one point of aim and just keep shooting there. Because what I'm trying to look for is a stable point of impact across charge weights, and then also kind of look at the aggregate group size of the 10 shots and the vertical aggregate of the 10 shots, and see which powder is kind of the most consistent under these conditions. What else? So when I aim at the upper left and upper right diamonds, I'm aiming at the bottom point of the diamond. So I have a very fine aim point, and I'm favoring toward the middle of the paper, and likewise when I'm aiming at the bottom 2 diamonds, I'm aiming at the top point of the diamond, so I'm favoring toward the middle of the paper in an effort to not lose any shots. And then I'm putting the Superformance in the middle, because that's kind of the wild card, and I think that might be the most unpredictable. So I'm going to put that in the middle on both bullet weights. So I'll get started here and take you guys along for the ride. Okay, so we're back at the bench here. In an effort to keep this video shorter, I opted not to do the time lapse of 100 shots being fired. So we're starting out by looking at the 75 grain ELDM results. Let me start off by saying the predictions that Gordon had for velocities were incredibly accurate. I would say everything was within 1% as far as what it predicted for the lower charge weights all the way through the higher charge weights, and that within 1% error, that can happen for a lot of reasons. One of them could be that the bore of the barrel is actually a little bit tighter than what the nominal spec is, and I don't have a way to measure that, so I wouldn't know if it was tighter than normal. The other thing is, so that can result in a barrel being quote-unquote fast. If it's a little bit tighter, it can produce more velocity. Also, from primer to primer, you can get some variation there in velocity, I've noticed.
from, you know, specific primer to specific primer. And Gordon's doesn't have an input for primers, so, you know, it's, anyway, within 1% is really good. So the 75 grain velocities started around kind of the 3100, 3200 neighborhood and finished in the high 32s, low 33s. Well, at least I think it did. The lab radar was being a little bit tricky on a couple of the powders, so there are some velocities I missed. But anyway, the overall, the results were pretty good, considering that each powder I used 10 different charge weights and then just fired at the same point of aim. So my point of aim was on the diamonds, I was aiming at the lower points of the diamond on the upper diamonds, and the lower diamonds I was aiming at the top point. So I never changed my point of aim for each powder. I just kept shooting and let the shots land where they land. And as a reminder, what we were trying to do was, one, find a safe operating range, which we did. We didn't see any dangerous pressure signs with any of these charge weights. I was able to fire all 50 rounds for the 75 grain and all 50 for the 80 grain. So we found our safe operating range, and then we were also looking for points in the ladder where the point of impact was the same, which we did find some. Some of them had 2 to 3 shots in a row where the impact was in the same place. So that's what we were looking for, and from that we were able to find a spot that we wanted to test with one with Superformance. Shots 4 and 5 landed in the same place, or basically the same place. It's essentially right in the center here. They're touching. And then Varget shots 8 and 9. Those had basically 0 vertical. So they were a little bit apart left and right, but essentially 0 vertical. And then CFE, we found 2 spots. Shots 2 and 3 were touching, and then shots 8 and 9 were touching. So we're going to test those. And then N540, shots 8, 9, and 10 were all kind of in this cluster right here. So these 3 shots above my fingernail were 8, 9, and 10. So we're going to test the center of that. But we'll basically load up charge 9 and test that. And then some of these velocities too, wherever these kind of sweet spots are, where the points of impact were similar, had very similar velocities. So like Varget charges 8 and 9 that we're going to test further, the velocity in both shots was 32.22. So even though the charge weight was different, the velocity was identical. And then CFE shots 2 and 3 were 31.70 and 31.61. So that's pretty good, considering it's a 0.12 grain difference in charge weight. It's only have 9 feet a second different. That's pretty good. And then N540 shots 8, 9, and 10. It didn't track 10, but 8 and 9 were 32.53 and 32.63. So we're going to test basically the 9th charge weight. So overall, the 75 shot good, and we have some spots that we want to explore further. And the reason we're doing this is I've found that this can be kind of a quick and dirty way to find a decent load without doing too much screwing around. So you're kind of trying to find your safe operating range, then you're looking for where consecutive shots have the same point of impact. And I've found that when you do that and you find those shots that have the same point of impact, you pick a charge weight that's in between the 2 or 3, and you test it, you load up 5 rounds and test it again, you usually have a decent load. And depending on what your expectations are, you may want to tweak it further, you may not. So now I'm going to try to pan the camera over so you can see the 80 grain. So bear with me here. And the 80 grain, I would say, won the day. Overall, it shot smaller groups as a whole. Superformance was similar between the 2 bullet weights. CFE was worse on the 80, but the other 3 were significantly better. With N540 being the standout. So the the group that you saw at the beginning was the 80 grain with N540, where the overall group was .655. And we had a couple of sequences there where 3 shots or more landed in the same place, so we'll definitely be exploring that further. Again, predicted velocities by Gordon's was really accurate. They all started in the mid 3s, some in the high 3s, 3,000 feet a second, and then finished, Superformance finished at 3205, which we were kind of thinking we were going to hit 3200. IMR4895 and Varget were right at 3150. CFE was 3177 and N540 was 3166. So again, a little bit below what Gordon's predicted, but still within 1%, which is really good. And what we found out of this that we wanted to test further was in Superformance, shots 1 and 2 are right here. So it's basically these 2 shots that are touching. So we're going to explore that further. IMR4895 was shots 8 and 9. Also, Superformance, shots 1 and 2 were 3088 and 3099. 11 feet a second, not bad. IMR4895, shots 8 and 9 were 3153 and 3152. And those are both in this hole right here. And then Varget, 5 and 6 were 3106 and 3119. And those are essentially sharing a hole where I watched all this on video in slow-mo to figure out where these shots hit, but essentially right where the indicator, where the little end of my brush is here. CFE223, shots 8 and 9 were 3125 and 3140, and those are both right here, touching. And then N540, this was the standout. Shots 3, 4, and 5 were 3090, 3111, 3124, and they're all in this hole. Under, you know, those 3 shots are under .100, even though it's 3 different charge weights, basically across 3.5 tenths of powder. And then 7, 8, and 9 were 3157, 3150, and 3174, and they're all in this hole. Again, under .100. So, really good results as far as I'm concerned. Again, this was all shot at 100 yards. And they were all loaded, 75s and 80s were all loaded at 7 thousandths jump. And maybe that's why the 80 outshot the 75. Maybe the 80 just liked 7 thousandths jump, or there was something about it that it liked. So next what we're going to do is we're going to test these sweet spots that we found. That's what I'm calling them, is where, you know, the shots all landed in the same place. We're going to test those sweet spots, load them up, 5 rounds of each, and test those at 200 yards. Why 200? We're getting a little more wind involved, but when it's shooting this precise, you know, when they're all in the same hole at 100, it's really hard to glean anything from that. So at 200 yards, they're going to start to open up more, and you'll get a little bit of a better idea of what's going on, as far as how they're trying to group, what kind of vertical they'll hold, you know, because if there's wind, that's going to push it left and right a little bit, but typically there's not enough of an updraft or a downdraft to add vertical to it. So we're going to test them at 200 and see what we get, and then try to pick the standouts from the 75s and the 80s to decide what to pursue further. So that's what we got. I don't know if there's any other relevant information you guys want to know. I mean, pretty much every one, the vertical was under an inch. Some of them are around a ½ inch, like the N540 and the Varget were right about a ½ inch of vertical, for 4.5% powder variation. So that's really good. So yeah, so that's all we have for this one, and then next we'll be at 200 yards testing these sweet spots, and we'll see what we get there. So thanks for watching. Again, like and subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with any of your friends that you might find it interesting, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.